Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of September 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thomson, bringing us Eastern approaches from the Netherlands. Bit of confusion around, Mike.
Absolutely. We're going to start off with the lockdown in the northwest, which has mostly been lifted today, except where it hasn't. So more confusion. And well, Andy Burnham, who is the Mayor of Manchester, of course, absolutely disgusted by this. He was on the Radio 4 Today programme this morning. We find ourselves at a completely unsustainable position this morning. That's the politest way I can put it. He said, overnight we've had restrictions released in 2 boroughs where we've got a rising number of cases, in 1 case in the red zone. That sounds very, very serious, Brian. Oh. Yes, indeed. Righty ho. The only thing that he said that I'll say on one level I agree with was this: and neighbouring boroughs are still under restrictions, but with much lower numbers of cases. These restrictions were always hard to explain to the public, but they're completely illogical now. And of course, at a certain level, that's absolutely true. So the question is, what's actually going on here? Well, I'm going to suggest. I'm not going to say this as a fact, but I'm going to suggest that what's going on here is behavioural insights at work. So what we're doing is encouraging people to get more and more angry about the illogical nature of the rules. The rules seem illogical because they lift restrictions in one place where there seem to be rising numbers of cases, and they keep restrictions in other places where the cases aren't rising. And of course, this causes angst in people. And that angst gets expressed just as Andy Burnham is expressing it here, and results in demands for consistency. And of course, the demands for consistency fall on the lockdown side. Yeah. So this, in my opinion, is, and you may have a different view, but I'm very keen to hear it, Brian, this is behavioural insights at work as they mess with people's minds psychologically.
Well, no question of it, Mike. That is the game, which is to confuse the population, to stress the population, because in that state, they are more likely to do what the government wants. A little bit later, we're going to be talking about Piers Corbyn, who talks about this psychological operation. And I'll just say that over the last couple of weeks break for the UK column, I did get the opportunity to have a chat with a couple of MPs. It was quite an experience because clearly they know nothing. They know nothing about what's going on. They are completely ignorant of what government policy is and how it's being enacted. They don't know about key documents, such as the SAGE minutes about ramping up fear. So we've now got an administration, we're going to call it this Westminster of occupation, which is playing on people's minds, including the MPs and senior people in mayors and other local officials.
Absolutely. So look, I'm just going to bring these graphics back up from Monday's programme. Now, the title of this confused a couple of people contacted me about this. This is the latest graphs from Public Health England. The data release is called Weekly Coronavirus Disease 2019 Surveillance Report. And of course, it's not referring to 2019, it's referring to coronavirus disease 2019, which is COVID-19. So, this is the latest data that was released on Friday. And of course, this is the graph that everybody's basing their illogical decisions on, the case graph. And of course, the mainstream press not asking any questions about this. I mean, for example, if we put the Daily Mail's version of that on screen, this is what they're focusing on. Everything is about this, the number of infections per day in the UK. And the point we were making on Monday, I just want to make it again, of course, is that actually when you normalise those case numbers per 100,000 in this case, and look at where we're at the moment, we can see that that graph actually that the mainstream media is pushing out is pretty it's not really representative of reality.
It's misleading.
Totally.
Like it's not only is it misleading, it's deliberately misleading.
I believe that's the case. And of course, then you ask the question, should we be even using numbers of cases to drive policy at all? Because when we start looking at hospitalizations and admissions to intensive care units, we find that those are as near to zero as makes no difference. So, this is a completely untenable situation that we're in with the decisions being made. But if anybody is in doubt about why decisions appear to be illogical. It's for two reasons. First of all, because it's being based on cases, and second of all, because we've got behavioural science at work here, which inevitably results in a policy which appears illogical to the public, but is designed to drive a psychological effect.
Psychological breakdown. Just as an anecdotal story, like last week I got a Chinese takeaway in the evening, so I'm one side of the road. I can't go in that Chinese, I have to queue outside or stand outside. They've got a table across the doorway where you can ask for your order, and the gentleman served me was wearing a mask, so I can't go into the Chinese takeaway. I wasn't wearing a mask, the man serving was wearing a mask, but he also told me he couldn't sell alcohol. That's on the south side of the road. On the north side of the road was a pub where people were in the pub eating and drinking, and we've got different rules depending on what side of the road you were on.
Right.
I pointed this out to one of the ladies queuing behind me, and this strange look came across her face, and then she said, yes, it is ridiculous. So people can see through it, they just need a bit of help.
Absolutely. Well, of course, the other story that we mentioned on Monday was the protests in London and the fact that Piers Corbyn had been singled out, in fact, for some special treatment from the police. He has been running a crowdfunder to fight this on a legal basis, and it's actually doing very, very well at the moment. So he's raised £15,500. I would ask anybody that feels so inclined to help with this, because I think it's an important case, so he's hoping to reach what's that, £18,000 by in another 2 days. So
yeah.
So please contribute to that if you possibly can.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of courage to do what Piers is doing. So the more support and public support that he gets, the better. Now, we just wanted to highlight, many people actually have commented on this, the interview with Good Morning Britain and Piers Corbyn, and can't show you the actual video itself, that will be a problem, but let's just have a look at some of that dialogue and how it went. And I'm going to push this across pretty strongly because, of course, we hope that people will give Piers Corbyn that support. So this is the team. We've got Piers Morgan. We're going to
this is going to cause problems,
well,
isn't it?
as I'll explain in a minute, the Piers did cause a bit of joviality, but that was soon crushed in this incident. But we've got Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid, who's their centre, and of course Piers Corbyn on the right. Now, I just want to point out that the lady we've got on screen, and I am going to make an issue of this, is clearly dressed to impress. So this is not about brain power, this is about how much cleavage she can actually put forward, and she's putting forward quite a lot. I'm going to stay on this subject because I don't think this is a joke. I'm not mentioning this as a joke, I'm mentioning it because these are the people we are allowing to basically tell us a pack of lies about what's happening. So we've got fake news, but what was really unbelievable in this interview was the sheer ignorance of the Good Morning Britain team and their bullying personal attack on Piers Corbyn. It was quite disgraceful. And I will just give you this clip showing the sort of the sneer of this lady, Susanna Reid, which she produced very early on. You might have to watch it because it happens, sorry, watch it twice because it happens quite quickly. She's smirking at Piers Corbyn as they get lined up for this aggressive attack. And what sort of woman is she? Well, you've only got to go to her own Twitter page to see that she's posted this little video clip. So this is nothing about the truth, getting facts out of people. This is all about my image, how I look, who am I? Well, she really looks like this because it took the Daily Mail to say that she had posted a picture of herself. And I'm going to say, wouldn't it be better if Susanna Reid actually got in front of the cameras looking as she really is? Because I think she'd do perfectly well without going through the makeup process. So let's have a look. Well, the first question from Piers Morgan was straight into the fact that, well, you really broke the law. So this is what he said. Clearly, when you did this rally, you would have known you were breaking the law, technically. Did that bother you? And the answer that Piers Corbyn came straight back with was, we had a lot of discussions, ongoing discussions with the police, and everything was okay. They agreed to enable our rally to end in a march to Downing Street. We're a political rally and those are allowed. However, at the last minute, a different group of policemen turned up and arrested me. And when I was in the van, I asked them what was going on, and they indicated that, quote, this came from on high. So in that answer back, Piers Corbyn said there was something strange going on because I'd worked with the police and they told me that what we were doing was okay, but somebody on high put their oar in. He said, so as far as we can see, it was a political decision to arrest me and to allow the Black Lives Matter event just down the road to happen. That was a pretty powerful response. And to his credit, Piers Morgan did pick up on this. He said, it's an interesting point. I'm not sure why you're being singled out for a £10,000 fine when clearly there have been a lot of other mass protests. What was the reason given to you that you have been targeted when so many others, as you said, BLM protests have taken place without anyone being fined? And Piers Corbyn came back. He said they do not give a reason, and you, Piers, should challenge Sadiq Khan why he has got political policing in London, and if it's not political, to allow us to have another rally on the 26th of September. Now, I think this is a very, very important exchange here, because we're now talking about political policing. This has occurred north of the border in Scotland, where Nippy was giving agreement to Black Lives Matter marches. But here we're seeing if the government doesn't agree with your march, you get a different form of policing. Perhaps we could bring Alex in just to comment on the impact on the law. We're into very, very dangerous territory now, Alex, where the law seems to be made up on the hoof, depending on what the political viewpoint is.
Yes, Brian, we've got several levels of problem and corruption here. It's particularly acute in a common law jurisdiction like England, because so much has been done on the basis of assuming the honour and goodwill of officers of the law in the past. Once again, I am struck by the coordinated nature of this change in policing, because it's just over the last weekend, with the events in Berlin, in Dublin, in London, and various parts of the United States, to name just four. I think there are many other countries and jurisdictions we could name. In all of these cases, I have seen, in some cases video, but certainly well described testimony by the organisers. I'm thinking of John Waters and Gemma O'Doherty in Dublin. I'm thinking of some of the people who've been live streaming from the Tiergarten in Berlin on Saturday and Sunday. In all of these cases, they dealt with usual policing channels to book their demonstration, were told everything was fine, and within the dying embers, this always seems to be around 4 or 5 p.m. at these events. There seems to be a modus operandi to do that. When the event is already peacefully dispersing, as discussed, a new group of policemen come along and, depending on the jurisdiction, lift them. Of course, Germany has savage policing, so you just get bent double straight away. In the case of the Dublin protest, it was a new bunch of Gardaí coming along saying, take that banner down, in contravention of previous, this was a banner over a motorway bridge on the M11 that can be seen from RTE headquarters, the Irish public broadcaster. There seems to be a coordinated attempt now to send new teams of police officers in, often younger, more drilled, and taking orders from some kind of mid-level officer that was not the same officer that was dealt with at first. And I do have to observe, while we're on this, people may find it distasteful, but this coordinated level of one policing team countermanding another is something we've seen very often before in England and in Scotland, when people have credible reports of elite child abuse.
Yes. Fascism, I'll just say it's what we are seeing built, what is emerging from the shadows, is essentially a fascist state under the Conservatives. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would, because the word fascism is much contested. David Scott often says, he did so again on Monday, that it's very much open to question what fascism is. Do we call it far right, far left, or do we just simply call it the outer point of a horseshoe? What characterizes fascism is subject to endless debate, but at the very basic level, it's not the mid-20th century idea. of telling people what to do through state structures. It's more hand in glove than that. It is essentially, and this is what the Conservative Party in Britain excel at, is the appearance of still having liberties. But if people wish to broadcast themselves with the wrong opinions, for example, or go out on the streets with unfashionable views, then the apparatus will make it extremely uncomfortable for them. And disingenuous secondary or tertiary charges will be stuck at people. Because it's still not at the stage in Britain that you can come out as you could do in some continental jurisdictions and say we don't like these kinds of views. It has to be done through backdoor routes, such as you're frightening the horses. What you're saying is untoward. So yes, that is a kind of fascism, but it's one iteration removed from full statism. It is really that the state controls the broadcasting channels and the policing far more than it appears to.
And of course, we can see this brutal style of policing emerging in other countries. Australia is one we're going to mention in a moment. Let's come back to the Piers and Piers interview. So Piers Morgan responded on the subject of the dual standards of the police with regard to Piers Corbyn. He said, on that point, it seems irrational and unfair, and quote, we will ask Sadiq Khan. Now, I think this is something for our viewers to pick up on, because GMB have said they will tackle Sadiq Khan on what was going on with the policing here. And I think Piers Morgan should be held to account. But on he went. What were you protesting about? He said to Piers Corbyn, do you believe the coronavirus pandemic is real? And this was Piers Corbyn reply. There are various views on this. Some doctors are saying what we're seeing is some sort of flu that's been around for 46 years. And others say it doesn't exist at all. It's a virus and everything that is happening is exaggerated. What we're doing is challenging the government to give actual evidence that there is a virus, to show under standard tests that there is a virus. Now, I think this is a very powerful reply, because, of course, the onus is going straight back on the government to prove what it's doing is correct. So there was nothing wrong with this reply from Piers at all. But this takes the biscuit, because back comes the lovely Susanna, who was getting very emotional. She said this, hang on a minute, the Prime Minister himself was hospitalised with the virus. How much more evidence do you need? So we are to see on screen that the Prime Minister has gone in hospital. We are told that he is suffering from coronavirus or COVID, and we are to believe that, according to this lady. And I think that this question shows the limit of her brain power, because she's now believing her own propaganda, or the propaganda that's coming out. So Piers responds. He says, well, he was hospitalised with the virus. Was he hospitalised with the virus, or was he ill from something else? There have been a lot of claims going on, and there might have been something happening in the past which is not happening now. And the debate is getting pretty unpleasant already at this stage. You are suggesting the British Prime Minister invented having a virus that may not exist. This is where you started to see really the nasty undertone of Piers Morgan as well. And Piers Corbyn held it together pretty well. He said, I don't know if anyone invented it or not, but I would say that the numbers of people getting whatever they're getting is declining rapidly, and there is no justification whatsoever for continuing lockdown. And you've just shown those figures yourself, Mike. So in came Piers Corbyn. Let me jump in. 25 million people around the world have tested positive for coronavirus, COVID-19, and over 800,000 people have died from COVID-19. That is a demonstrable fact.
Is it?
What part of that do you think does not constitute a pandemic? Well, we're going to show that what Piers Morgan is saying is utter nonsense here, but we'll stick with the reply from Piers Corbyn. Well, 800,000 people have died, and that's been labelled COVID when it might have been completely something else. It is not a pandemic, because the numbers dying are nothing different from a normal year of dying, as they die all the time. And it's not a consequence. It's not a high consequence infectious disease. And that was declared by the government and the World Health Organization on March the 19th. And he goes on to say, what we have is a psychological operation to close down the economy in the interests of mega corporations who are going to gain out of massive joblessness happening upon us now. And back she comes, because now she's getting very excited indeed. More than 40,000 people have died in this country as a result of COVID directly. What an insult to their families to say that this is some sort of fiction and blame it on the pharmaceutical companies. And I'm going to say we're going to label that fake news, because none of the statistics show that 40,000 people have died of COVID alone. And we've got confirmation of the latest statistics just to do with deaths for COVID. And for the Centres for Disease Control and Prevention here, which is one of the best sources, it's saying that that figure is now just 6% of the deaths. So if we look at that against the United States, which is the primary statistics, they're saying that 6% of 856,180 is 51,371 total deaths for COVID-19 in the States. And then they go on to say this is not a pandemic, and therefore all the associated regulations and pandemic should be null and void. Sorry, that was comment by the person who obtained those statistics. It's not a pandemic, and therefore all the associated regulations regarding a pandemic should be null and void. And if we use that 6% figure against the UK figures, we find that a mere 2,490 people have died from COVID alone to date. And before we came away, the figure was about 1,800, 1,900.
The official figure was about
Yes,
1,800, 1,900. But of course, we've got to remember that the British government has already had to walk back from the statistics for people that they were attributing as having died from COVID-19. They've reduced, they slashed 5,000 people off that number just before we broke up for the summer holiday. Yeah. Well, there are still very big questions to be asked about whether that was an appropriate number or whether it was vastly underestimated once again.
Yes. So there we are. Good Morning Britain using every trick, bullying, personal attacks, skewing or downright lies with what the actual statistics are in order to get an opinion across, which essentially backed what we're describing as a fascist government at work. So watch the video yourself. You should watch that interview yourself, see it all. But if you disagree with it, then you should be on the phones to Good Morning Britain to challenge them. And we just end by the fact that in the comments underneath, although many of them were very derogatory of Piers Corbyn, there were some other comments. But here's Susanna Reid's Twitter page, and she says in her own words at the top that she's a liberal snowflake TV clothes horse. So that's her words at the top of her Twitter page. I think she's a narcissist. I think this lady is very dangerous in being part of a propaganda machine. And luckily, one or two people really picked up, wow, just watch the interview, all of you bullies. If you were my mother or you were my daughter, I'd be ashamed of you. Disgusting and vile behaviour, sold your soul. And this one, ignorance and disgusting rudeness by all the Good Morning Britain team this morning, but no surprise there, of course. And after turning it off, I won't be watching that programme again. No wonder he can't get any politicians to appear. So a snapshot analysis there, Mike, of some of Britain's worst propaganda. But until people start to see through this stuff, they're not going to get to the bones of the great lie over this so-called pandemic.
Absolutely. So the question is, where does it end up? And I was speaking to Ian Crane yesterday. He's got contacts in Australia, as everybody knows. And well, of course, in Australia, Victoria is the main area where the real draconian response is taking place. And so many people talking about this morning. Daily Mail covered it as well. Zoe Lee, the Zoe Lee arrest in Victoria. She had created a Facebook event to organise a protest in Ballarat, Victoria. And so the police invaded her home. She live streamed it. They presented a search warrant. They took computers and so on. So she was handcuffed in her lounge in front of her children and was accused of offences but with respect to encouraging gatherings. So you're not allowed to encourage a gathering, Brian. And Well, actually, if anybody hasn't seen this guy, this is Sky News described as a pundit, Alan Jones in Australia. He's been producing some monologues on the whole coronavirus response in Australia, and mostly they have been extremely good. He's absolutely enraged by what happened to Zoe Lee. He said, "Thankfully, I'm not the only Australian who thinks this is appalling, disgusting and disgraceful. The only person guilty of incitement is the Premier of Victoria. His outlandish grab for power, his disdain for any accountability is forcing people to behave sorry, there's a misprint in that. Behaviour simply designed to take back their freedom." So, you know, strong comments from at least one mainstream media personality in Australia over what's going on in Victoria. You know, Ian, when I was speaking to Ian Crane yesterday, he was expressing what he had been told from people there, the massive concern over the level of crackdown in that state.
Well, the media people must realise at some point that this process is going to affect them. They're not going to be immune to this sort of policing. Alex, come back to you on it. I'm amazed at how naive reporters are within the so-called mainstream, because they seem to think this thing can build itself and they're going to carry on life as normal.
Well, without pulling any elitist card, Brian, I would say it helps if you're a Cambridge graduate, because if you go back for dinners at your alma mater, you get hobnobbing to people who used to be your drinking chums aged 20, so they're quite frank with you, and now they're writing for a broadsheet. And you have an impression, because of their student background or whatever, their education and their output, that they're serious. And then over a glass of wine, what they'll admit to you is it's all about pushing narratives and agendas. And then the swearing comes out, the completely prejudicial language about the 95% of the country that don't think like them rolls off the tongue. So yes, it was known to people in some circles, I think, how unconcerned with the truth journalism was. Just regarding Victoria, they have spent, as has Ireland, about 15 years preparing for this tyranny by having common purpose style, and in some cases common purpose people, injected into their state apparatus in Melbourne, particularly a British organisation called Future Gov, which was very much a common purpose spin-off from the London boroughs, went out there and colonised Melbourne as its foothold in Australia. And also they went down the sexual liberation path at the same time as Ireland did. So around 2003, I think it was, Victoria made a signal move to legalise brothels. These things are not by chance, because the view that rulers have of the human body is very much like Aldous Huxley, you know, tyrannous control of the body, but on the other hand, let the plebs get up to their jollies without restriction in order to keep their mind off serious things. Just to regard that 6% number as well, if people want an unpacking of those CDC statistics, I recommend a video that they'll easily find on YouTube by searching "When is coronavirus not coronavirus?" and they will find John Cullen, that's spelt with an EN, John Cullen speaking to Jason Goodman yesterday. You can start that video from around 11:45, that's where the meat starts, or if you're short of time, go to 40 minutes, and you will find lots of unpacking of how the CDC has deliberately withheld from its download patches the crucial statistics from their weekly uploads. This may be going on with some of the politicized statistics across the Western world. We know that British and Irish statistical bodies are producing more honest data than their medical equivalents. So even where there are downloadable statistics for people to play with, I think it should be worldwide now. Look very carefully at what is on the website updates, not just what's available for a downloaded zip file. Some of the crucial data is being left out, and John Cullen explains very well how this pointed him towards what he calls the double hump, and comparisons with the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918 are very revealing, how the spin of the numbers is actually being perpetrated.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Excellent, thank you for that. Well, over the holiday break, a gentleman said to me it would be great to have some uplifting news amongst the accurate reporting that the UK column does. I was going to save these emails to the end, because I think these are very good news. We are seeing more and more people starting to act themselves, challenging the establishment as to what's going on. And just keep the flavour. We've had Australia, we better bring in New Zealand here, otherwise we'll be in trouble. This is a really excellent email which has come to us from New Zealand. The person says, I've sent to Ministry of Health, waiting for their response, but also wrote to Auckland Transport, the government department that runs the city's transport. Here is their reply. Thank you for getting in touch with Auckland Transport. During Alert Level 2, our public transport services are operating at a capacity limit. This means that even though passengers are on board, they're not forced to be in a confined space with one another. As an example of this is that buses are only allowing around 15 passengers on board at a time. Because of this, a risk assessment on face mask usage in confined space has not been conducted and is not deemed necessary. Thank you again for taking the time to get in touch. Now, the person who'd initiated this question was, of course, delighted because they'd got the evidence that no risk assessment had been carried out. So the email went on, although I think they assumed I was worried about catching the virus. I'm not. They've answered the question, no risk assessment. Well, I'm geared up now to take this to the next level. I'm reporting them to WorkSafe, the New Zealand equivalent of Health and Safety Executive. I just wanted to share this with you because you and your team are doing a brilliant job of making a difference in this unjust world we live in. Thank you and best wishes, Elle. So a great boost for us in the column, but this is exactly what's needed, which is millions of people standing up to be counted and challenging the system and using their own evidence back against them. So we're going to say well done to the NZ team.
Unemployment, well, what have we got? But in the ages 16 to 24, in that age group range, I think we've got something like 550,000 unemployed young people at this point in time. But we don't need to worry because the government is riding to the rescue with the Kickstart Scheme. There we go. So what's this all about then? Well, on the 8th of July, the Chancellor announced the Kickstart Scheme as part of the Plan for Jobs. Plan for Jobs is £2 billion. And it's apparently going to create all kinds of new jobs. So it's going to create hundreds of thousands of new fully subsidised jobs for young people across the country. So these are 6-month places. I don't know where these people are going to get placements because there's no companies hiring and no companies doing, at least relatively few, doing any actual work still. So it's open to those aged between 16 and 24 who are claiming universal credit and at risk of long-term employment. And it'll be available across a range of different sectors in England, Scotland and Wales. And the first placements are likely to start from November. Now here's the key thing, Brian. Funding is available for 100% of the relevant national minimum wage for 25 hours a week, plus associated employer national insurance contributions and employer minimum automatic enrolment contributions. And there's also £1,500 per job placement available for setup costs, support and training. So that all sounds very good. But then we get to the kicker. Funding is available following a successful application process. Applications must be for a minimum of 30 job placements. If you're unable to offer this many job placements, you can partner with other organisations to reach the minimum number. So it already becomes a massive administrative burden on small businesses in particular. Now, it's small businesses in particular that are suffering most here, and it's the small businesses in particular that need the support. And I would imagine that small businesses in particular would really appreciate being able to take advantage of a scheme like this, but they're already ruled out of it because not many small businesses require 30 interns effectively for 6 months at this point in time. And so now they automatically have to go through a process of trying to find 29 other small businesses that want to do the same thing. So this is basically set up to fail as far as I can see in terms of being really productive, other than getting people, well, where are young people going to end up in what, call centres or something like this?
Well, and they're going to end up in the big society network. They're going to be working for some of the trusts and charities and other organisations that are there, but they're not proper jobs. That's what they're going to do with them, I think. I'll just say, you're now onto the subject. Piers Corbyn said quite rightly, a psychological attack whilst the big companies hoover up what remains of the companies put out of business as a result of this deliberate lockdown.
Yes. Now let's bring Mark Sedwill back onto the screen, probably for one of the last times, if not the last time, because he is leaving his job within the next 2 or 3 days. He was, of course, National Security Advisor, head of the National Security Council, and therefore in charge of all the intelligence services, also head of the UK Civil Service, and also head of the Cabinet Office, and therefore responsible for a lot of the censorship and regime that's going on at the moment. Now, back at the end of July, I think it was, we highlighted that David Frost had been appointed to replace him as National Security Advisor. So David Frost, who's currently running the Brexit negotiations, we'll be talking a little bit more about those in a second, becomes head of the National Security Council and then providing oversight of the various intelligence agencies. We'll be glad to know that we now know who is the head of the UK Civil Service and the Cabinet Office. It's this man, Simon Case. So the Prime Minister has appointed Simon Case as the Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service. He's currently the Permanent Secretary in number 10. He will succeed Mark Sedwill in a day or two's time. Well, if we just briefly run through his CV, it's quite interesting. He was Trinity College, Cambridge. He studied history. He then went on to do a PhD in political history at Queen Mary University, London. His thesis was the Joint Intelligence Committee and German Question, 1947 to 61. He was looking at how the assessment from the Joint Intelligence Committee informed government policy during the Cold War. In 2006, he joined the Civil Service as a policy advisor at the Ministry of Defence. And then he held roles in the Cabinet Office, the Northern Ireland Office, GCHQ, and on the Olympic Secretariat, which was involved in the 2012 Olympic Games in London. And then he became private secretary to the Prime Minister David Cameron in 2012. He then went back to the Cabinet Office Implementation Group. Then he went back to number 10, where he worked as a principal private secretary to the Prime Minister. He was then involved in the Brexit talks and left in 2018 to become Prince William's private secretary. And then he returned earlier this year back into number 10, this time to help with the coronavirus response. So here's what Boris Johnson had to say about it. He said, Simon's years of experience at the heart of government and working for the royal household make him ideally suited for this crucial role. And so my first question is, why does working for the royal household make him ideally suited for the crucial role? Might come back to that in a second. Well, what did he have to say? He said, I'm grateful to Mark Sedwill for the kindness and support he has given me in my career, and I wish him well for his next chapter. And Alex, if I could get some thoughts from you on this guy and what he is, because it's not entirely clear, because my understanding is that, yes, he did work with Ollie Robbins in the Brexit team, which of course was a discredited Brexit team, which was Theresa May's Brexit team, which is effectively keeping us in the fully in the European Union. But he left in 2018. Actually, he was kicked out because he didn't agree with what Ollie Robbins and that team was doing. So I'm not clear where this guy sits is he with Brexit or what is he? And what do you know of him as an ex-GCHQ man?
To start with the last point, I think it's quite telling that I know precisely nothing about him. I left GCHQ in 2009, the same year that Mr. Case was finishing his PhD. Like you, I zoomed in on it, and the précis of it that's on the Queen Mary website ends the summary by saying that the Joint Intelligence Committee, or JIC, ensured, this is in the era when the Soviet Union was being presented as the existential threat, which of course it was, but a certain angle was taken in Whitehall, obviously, and in Washington. The JIC ensured that it became an essential tool for successive governments. Yeah? So he's investigating how, and this is before he got posted to GCHQ and before he was Cameron's political private secretary, how the mechanisms of the Cabinet Office made themselves indispensable in presenting or being the filter to perceive threats coming from Russia, right? So that model was being set up then. Case got an expert in that before he was parachuted in. It is unusual, or it was before the all change of 2010, it was unusual for people who had no GCHQ interior experience to be parachuted into the board, and he became DS, Director Strategy, which frankly is not one of the heavy-hitting directorate roles. It's one of the second-tier ones, but he was put in there to politicize GCHQ, I would say. And to answer the first question you raised, Mike, what kind of Brexit does he advocate? Well, the man's own words make it perfectly clear that he is a Sedwill stooge, Sir Mark Lackey. Thank you for patronage, is what he said in his own terms. The royal household reference, by the way, is probably due to the fact that the Cabinet Office people, particularly in the intelligence underbelly of it, are often double-hatted to have royal household roles. So that's not very well advertised, of course, but that's probably what was going on. So it indicates he was pretty senior even within the Cabinet Office secret apparatus. So what kind of Brexit? Well, if he's a Sedwillite, then and the Times has reported this today, that he fell out with Robbins because he was better plugged into Brussels than Ollie Robbins was, and even Theresa May's team couldn't stand that. He was even more pro-Brussels than them. Well, let's nuance that. I think what they fell out about is this: the Ollie Robbins team were just lifting and copying and pasting the Brussels edicts in the same way as the Angus Lapsley Brigade have been doing in military union work, as David Ellis has pointed out. But I would suggest that Case took the Sedwillite line, which has always been, let us unite the continent in order to be top dog through our dark arts, our soft skills, our soft power and our influence. Which, by the way, if we go into extra time, I'll point out much the same with regard to Millie Weaver's extremely important documentary on ShadowNet. There's probably too much to say about that in the main news, but I do want to cover that thoroughly, because it's the same coterie saying, let us get in between the facts and government, whether it's COVID or the Russian threat or whatever it may be, and present it in a certain way. I don't think Robbins was up to that intellectually. I don't think he was enough of a Machiavellian. So probably that's what they fell out over, is that he realized that Case actually had a bigger agenda and a bigger patrone than Robbins himself had. Ergo, of course, Sedwill's more important than Theresa May, but I think we knew that anyway.
Yes, but I mean, one of the things that we've been highlighting over the last couple of years has been the situation of having this level of power in the hands of one person, Mark Sedwill. How do you think that's going to play out over the next period of time if we've got somebody who's rabidly pro-Europe, head of the civil service and in the Cabinet Office, and somebody who is apparently at least rabidly anti-Europe as National Security Advisor? We had a bad situation with Sedwill with him holding all those roles, but if you have people that are taking such disparate positions, there's going to be conflict there, right?
Well, this kind of dysfunctionality is routine in the Foreign Office and the MOD. Certainly, I saw it in my decade in service, and FCO teams and MOD teams would take me aside, not just me, but anyone who was from a third agency, and swear in my presence about the other people. So all this briefing against the other team is quite well known. The question is who trumps, and in every case, those who are at the heart of the Cabinet Office trump, because they've got the reserve powers of the Crown under so-called royal prerogative, and they've got more levers to pull. And ultimately, as Simon Case said in his PhD before he entered this murky world, he made his study and he drew the correct conclusions that he who controls the intelligence assessment controls the politicians. So I think the knives are out for Sir David Frost, and I think he realises that. I do hope he has some allies.
Okay, well, let's move on then. If you like what the column does and you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, and there are options to help us out there, and that would be very much appreciated.
Okay, and we're just another thanks to viewers and listeners because you're doing things. This is brilliant. Email to UK Column on the subject of returning to school. It says, according to Public Health England's Returning to Primary Schools document, children can have COVID or be asymptomatic, but if they need to take time off school because they're displaying symptoms, testing and isolation is recommended. My son is desperate to return to school since he's grown increasingly upset over time at having missed his fellow classmates so much. I will be sending him back, but will refuse any testing. Ipsos Mori, with its unfortunate Latin translation of they die, I hear of the company involved with testing, two companies involved with data collection that merged into another ugly Goliath. The only faith I have in the school is his head teacher, who will not be temperature checking children upon entry or setting up thermal imaging cameras, as will be the case in my daughter's secondary school. and has stipulated that children are not permitted to wear masks in school since we feel it will be detrimental to their well-being. Thanks for your great work. Much gratitude. So good to see parents sticking up for their children. And this is just a very short email, and I think it's a good one. There's a whole chain of emails that have prompted this one, but it's an email sent to the Right Honourable Peter Dowd MP. I'm not sure what we do not agree on. My question is simply, do you and your party support the government implementation for children to be wearing masks in school and social distancing measures? Question mark. This only requires a yes or no answer. So a very short to the point email, but the sort of email that MPs don't like because there's nothing to try and hide amongst. It's very clear and direct.
Now, last July, we highlighted the government's consultation on confirming online identity. They're very concerned about the number of people needing to access government services and all kinds of other services from all kinds of other companies that have to prove, and they have to prove their identity in order to access those services. So, for example, 2.6 million people made a claim for the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme online since it launched on the 13th of May. With 1.4 million having no prior digital identity credentials and needing to pass through the UK tax authorities' identity verification scheme. So that's what they're saying. So they are going to implement a new digital identity strategy board focusing on 6 principles, and they're also going to run a pilot scheme, and it's going to be run through the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. So they're also exploring how secure checks could be made against government data. So the document checking service pilot scheme is being launched this month. We'll come on to that in a second, which allows the government to give people easier and safer access to digital services which require identity checks, so long as online mortgage applications, financial services and recruitment onboarding. So if you're applying for a mortgage, Brian, if you want to get a job, then of course part of the vetting process for a mortgage or a job will involve identity checks and record checks at government level. So we're seeing the merging of corporate and government data in order to decide whether you're a valid person for a mortgage or whether you deserve to have a job. So let's just briefly have a look at the six criteria here. Privacy. When personal data is accessed, people will have confidence that there are measures in place to ensure their confidentiality and privacy. For instance, a supermarket checking a shopper's age, a lawyer overseeing the sale of a house, or someone applying to take out a loan. So in those cases, just going into a supermarket and buying a packet, a carton of beer is going to result in a check against the government database. This is spectacular. Transparency. When the individual's identity data is assessed when using digital identity products, they must be able to understand by whom, why and when. For example, being able to see how your bank uses your data through digital identity solutions. Inclusivity. People who want or need digital identity should be able to obtain one. For example, not having documentation such as a passport or driving license should not be a barrier to having a digital identity. Interoperability. Setting technical and operating standards to use across UK's economy to enable international and domestic interoperability. So this will stretch, not just, won't be restricted to national borders in any way. Proportionality, the user needs and other considerations such as privacy and security will be balanced so that digital identity can be used with confidence across the economy. And finally, good governance. Digital identity standards will be linked to government policy and law. Any future regulation will be clear, coherent and aligned with the government's wider strategic approach to digital regulation. For example, firms verifying your identity will need to comply with laws around how they access and store data. But don't worry, because there are things in place. So no organisation will be given access to government-held data. Participating organisations will simply receive a yes, no or error message as to whether the document was validly issued, and no personal data not already provided by the individual would be used and shared. So you don't need to worry about this massive increase in the level of surveillance, and it will never be abused.
Well, I think it's designed to be abused, Mike. And of course, the other thing we've got is the government is continually working in partnership with companies. And I will say that what I think is going to happen, of course, is where they're working in partnership, those companies will have direct access to the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is just the British presentational wrapping for the agenda which has become known as global citizenship. And if I'm not mistaken, there's still a Blogspot site up called globalcitizen.blogspot.com or similar URL, which goes into detail on this, how ID 2020 was being pushed by the Gateses of this world before COVID came along. And by some people's assessments, one of the top 3 aims of the COVID crisis has been to push through ID 2020. We've just covered that Ireland has got its health passports. You have to have subterfuge more in the common law jurisdictions and a couple of other civil law ones like Finland, because those countries, common law plus the likes of Finland, on principle do not have population registers, whereas countries like the Netherlands here, or most continental countries, can seamlessly, behind the scenes, roll their population registers into a global digital model. I think the giveaway there, the tell-all, is what you pointed out, Mike, that irregulars or undocumented people or refuseniks who don't have passports and birth certificates will be included because it will be straight from biometric to world-level digital. In other words, passports and borders are just going to be for show from now on, even when we get to the question of lockdowns, a national lockdown, a regional lockdown. From the point of view of those controlling the global digital flow, the digital citizenship, it's all much of a muchness. It's just a question of which front authorities you're using.
Yeah, just very briefly, Alex, lots and lots of people, of course, criticising China for its regime, but frankly, the West is well out in front here.
Yes, because the level of collusion between public and private authorities, if anything, is worse in countries that follow, for example, the Scottish model of government since 2007, which is being actively exported, mostly to Western countries, of course, but also to China. It's worse than it would be in China itself, where there is residual, whether it's inefficiency or suspicion, which prevents a lot of private enterprises, to the extent that they exist in China, from willingly sharing. I think it's only in the West that idealists, often conscientious Christian types who think they're doing a world of good, will go out of their way to share information about their pupils, their patients, their wards, their social services clients, in order to feed the beast with more information. I don't think that happens outside the West to any great extent.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, while all this is going on, in the meantime, we continue with our narratives, our anti-Russian and anti-Chinese narratives with a view to conflict and continued pressure on the borders with Russia here. So here's the United States Army Artillery Brigade stationed in Germany. They're conducting a live fire training exercise called Railgunner Rush, and it's taking place in Estonia, and it's taking place 70 miles from the Russian border. Railgunner Rush will demonstrate the strong bilateral partnership between the US and Estonia and test the brigade's deployment capabilities, readiness and interoperability with NATO allies, according to a US Army statement. And the routine training exercise is not tied to any current events in the region, apparently, so that should keep us feeling safe. But in a sense, it is linked to events in the region. And I'm sure the Russians are shaking in their beds, Brian, as these guys get off the aircraft here with their face masks on. And I wonder how they're going to perform during this live fire exercise while they're suffering from hypoxia.
Who knows? Who knows?
For those listening and not watching, they're all getting off the transport aircraft wearing face masks. So it's fantastic. You're now effectively training for war in face masks. Fantastic stuff. The Russians, for their part, did call it provocative and dangerous, and this was their statement from the Russian embassy. Why this demonstrative saber rattling? What signal do NATO members want to send us? Who is actually fueling tensions in Europe? And all this is taking place in the context of an aggravated political situation in that region of the European continent. Rhetorical question: how would the Americans react if such shooting were carried out by our military near the US borders? I think that's a fair point, isn't it?
It's a very fair point, and I think we know the answer, which would be outrage, complete outrage.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, then, we've got more, because NATO claiming that Russian fighter jets violated NATO airspace over Bornholm Island. This was an Su-27 fighter basically buzzing a large US bomber. And apparently they got pretty close, and the US bomber crew was pretty upset by the whole thing. But nonetheless, the rhetoric that came out from NATO as a result of that, still continuing to push this idea that it's the Russians which are really, being aggressive here, when in fact it's the West which is pursuing the aggression, as far as I can see. And as for the Chinese, they also making comments recently. This is Wang Yi, who's the Russian foreign minister. He was speaking at the French Institute of International Relations, saying that basically the US-China relationship is at its most testing time since the establishment of diplomatic relations, and they also expressing concerns or wondering who is actually driving the policy. And Alex, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on who's driving this policy quite so hard.
Well, again, perhaps another hint of what we'll be seeing in extra time, because I think the Atlantic Council is ultimately the body you should be looking at, and that's a body over which we have so many question marks now. But they are effectively NATO's think tank. So, below the Secretary General level and the political, the North Atlantic Council level of heads of state and ministers, it's the question of the Atlantic Council where the strategic vector of NATO is resolved, and that's where the Partnership for Peace exercises for the areas around Russia, and also the exercises involving actual NATO member states now, like the Baltic Three, those are cleared at that level. The Atlantic Council is, it presents itself as a think tank. It's rather more than that. I think that they, more than the Pentagon, are deciding US troops' involvement in such matters.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're vastly out of time, but I just do want to cover these quickly. First of all, Brexit. Now, of course, many people still don't really understand what Brexit was about, because apparently we've already left. Well, of course, we've gone through the divorce. That was getting us out of the previous treaties, which included, of course, a veto. That gets us out of all that. We've now got a future relationship, which is under negotiation at the moment. And the main focus seems to be at this current point in the negotiation seems to be over fishing. So we had this from the Daily Express today: Brexit fisheries row, naval battle warning as EU braces for life without UK waters. Now, before I get you to comment on this, Brian, because I would imagine you're laughing, the first question that came to my mind was, really? Well, first of all, France takes, I believe, about 90%, or maybe something around 90% of the cod from the English Channel at the moment. But the problem is we don't have a navy. And actually, we're in a 50-year defence pact with the French through the Lancaster House and Sandhurst treaties. So even if we had a navy which could take any kind of action, how do we do it diplomatically?
Well, of course you can't. If you're going to take action, you're going to take action, and it's going to get pretty messy. But just a comment on the Navy. Of course, we do still have fishery protection ships, so there are some offshore patrol vessels, fishery protection vessels, that could do the job, whereas we don't really have an effective remains of the Navy. But we've heard all this stuff before. It's rhetoric. It's trying to ramp up fear in the population. It's complete and utter nonsense. One of the factors that encouraged me to leave the Navy was that, as captain of one of the fishery protection vessels, I watched as we destroyed our own fishing industry, and it was very clear to me what was going on. I decided I wasn't going to be part of that, and it's one of the things that influenced my decision to leave. So the betrayal of Britain's fishing industry has gone on over many years, nothing to do with the EU. It was betrayal by British politicians, and this is just stuff and nonsense.
Absolutely. So in fact, I'm going to call it fake news. But one thing which isn't fake news is Anne Widdecombe's opinion piece, also in the Express. There is no defence for Boris's evasion to important questions, says Anne Widdecombe. And this is actually a very good article, and I recommend people read it, because she's talking about European Defence Union, of course, and highlighting the fact that, once again, highlighting the fact that Boris Johnson and his defence team, his defence team will not talk about defence union in any way, shape or form. I think that article deserves to be read and also shared if possible.
Yeah.
And just very briefly then, I just wanted to mention this because moving back to Australia for a second, Facebook has issued this blog post, an update about changes to Facebook's services in Australia. And basically what this is about is Facebook is threatening to block publishers and individuals from sharing any kind of news on its platforms at all. Now this isn't just Facebook playing the censorship card here, because this is really about the massive fight between the social media companies, governments, and also the corporate media, who are very upset that they're not getting a cut of Facebook's ad revenue whenever people share stories on Facebook and whenever Facebook shares stories. So the Australian government is now attempting to push in new rules that would force Google and Facebook to pay publishers when they use the content. And so Will Easton, who's the managing director of Facebook Australia, has said in this blog post, assuming that the draft code becomes law, we will reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram. This is not our first choice, it's our last, but it's the only way to protect against an outcome that defies logic and will hurt, not help. And he's making the point that Facebook news feeds sent 2.3 billion clicks to Australian news websites in the past year. So effectively what is happening here is, of course, this has a chilling effect on the sharing of data. So that's the government's reason for pushing forward with this. The corporate media are dying to get part of this ad revenue, so they're supporting the government in this. But Facebook is going to fight them on it, and making the point that, of course, it's going to hurt the media companies if they're not getting those clicks. And it absolutely is. Well, look, if anybody wants to see how we've got to this point, do have a look at the UK Column website and the censored section. If you scroll down to about the middle of the page, you'll find that graphic that says censored on it. Click on there and you'll get a timeline. If you haven't seen that already, it's worth having a look at.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. I'll just end by saying that over the holiday period for us, we've had quite a few cards that have come in thanking us for what we're doing. This one's green, so I've got to keep it on the desk. But it says, "Freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might," which I think is pretty appropriate. And I was interested to see this has come from Armed Forces UK Limited. And a very nice message inside saying that we're doing a good job. We hope we are. We do our best, but of course we can only do it without the support of our viewers and listeners and supporters. We'll end there. We'll be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.